Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's or this morning's live stream, wherever you may be from. Today we're going to be talking about masking, or more specifically, I guess, how to improve the quality of your masks. We'll be covering things like luminosity masks, color masks, the magic brush, and some additional things like refining, feathering, and so forth. So that's the plan for today. Before we get to that, if you are on YouTube, welcome, or if you're on Facebook as well, welcome too. If you'd like to interact, drop a question and leave a comment, as many of you discovered already, then you can do so by just putting a comment in the YouTube chat. If you're in our live streaming room, then you can of course ask a question as well, and the way you do that is in the Q&A tab, just to keep it separate from the chat tab if you don't mind. It just makes it easier for myself and Marianne, who's also hanging out in the chat, to answer the questions. But don't feel you have to be silent. You can interact with each other in the chat as well, but just for Q&A it helps keep it all separate. Okay, let's move on. So as I said, today's about masking, and you might be jumping up and down and wondering, first of all, why am I covering masking now when we publicly announced quite a while ago now that we would be bringing AI masking to Capture One, which is true. And I'll tease you with a little bit about that later on when we look at a different image. But just because there's automated stuff on the horizon, I think it's still extremely important. One, so you know what's happening mechanically, or the mechanics in the background, and two, you know how to do something manually as well, because with all automated systems, nothing is 100% perfect, fallible, or whatever. So you need to know how to actually do something yourself under your own steam as well. And a lot of the stuff we're going to look at today as well is complementary to any auto AI masking or whatever. You still need to know how to refine things. You still need to have some control manually as well over where your masks want to be, how you want to use them, and so on and so forth. So in the same way, I'm sure you're not all running around with your cameras on program and fully automatic focus all the time. You're also part of that decision-making process. So everything you learn today will be useful. And of course, when we have new tools, we'll do the whole thing again, and we'll talk about combining new tools with existing tools. All of the things that Capture One offers you layer-wise and also application-wise is just a toolkit. And then of course, the skill comes in being able to choose the right tool for the job, as we say. So let's get on with it. That being said, oh, by the way, what was really nice to see, so on our live stream page, which is on at support.captureone.com, I opened up the comments on the sign up page, with the goal being it's nice to know what you want to hear about and what you would like to learn in various live stream, and a few questions did come up. So it's not immediately obvious that there's a comment section below the post, so just scroll down a bit and you'll be able to ask questions before the live session, or say, I'd love to learn about this, or I'd love to see that, which is exactly what concerns our first little sojourn into masking. So one of the questions was about masking skin tones. And sorry, I've been a terrible host. I should have looked up who answered the question, asked the question. So wave your hand if that was you. But the person asking the question said, it's kind of tricky for me to select skin tones, because quite often, and this is a good example, the hair color can be very similar to the skin tone, either in terms of color or in terms of luminosity. So it gets difficult to select the skin tone based on color range or based on tonality, which is very true. Drawing a mask by hand, of course, is a little bit tedious and not the easiest thing to do in the world as well. So how do we deal with a subject like this, and using the skin tone tool in particular? And the first thing that we're going to kind of talk about is couple of things. One, not worrying so much about selecting everything, and two, not worrying so much about necessarily having perfect masks. And we'll see a couple of examples later where you know, the more organic or soft your mask is, or the way the mask is created and refined or feathered or whatever, it just gives you a better, more natural end result. So we've got a subject here, and we've got warmer light coming from this side, and then colder light. Obviously she's in shadow, so we've got this typical issue where the color tone doesn't quite match up. And then, if I remember whose name it was, Andrew, I think Anthony was asking about fixing tan lines as well. So the skin tone tool can do all of those kinds of things. So in this particular case, we want to use our skin tone tab to even out the skin tones in terms of color, density, if you want to as well. So the first mistake that often people make is that, oh, I need to select the skin in its entirety, which is not the case. We only really need to correct the bits that need correcting, or mask the bits that need correcting. So I'll show you one method, or two methods actually, and then you can think about which one makes the most sense for your workflow. But the way I start is by creating, by creating a new filled adjustment layer. So if I tap on that and press M on my keyboard, or you can use the button up here. Oh, I just need to put do not disturb on my phone, otherwise that's going to ring again. Sorry if you heard that in the background. Or you can say always display mask here, M on the keyboard. Why am I starting by filling the image with a mask? Because I want to see what my adjustments are doing, visualize how they're going to correct the skin, and then I've got a choice. I can either then delete areas of the mask which simply aren't necessary, or I can clear the entire mask and brush it back in where it makes sense in those problem areas. But first of all, we've got our mask, so let's press M to hide that again, and we're going to select our good skin tone. So the way the color editor tool works, or the skin tone tab, is that we need to give Capture One a target skin tone. So I'm going to just click on the left hand side of her face here. That dot is the selection, and this, or sorry, that dot is the exact color tone where I clicked on her cheek, and this triangle is the range of colors that we are going to affect. So I'm going to widen that out a bit to make sure we catch all the problem areas. So now if we go down to uniformity, what's going to happen is, as I drag that slider to the right, everything within this color range selection will get transformed to that pick point. So everything in that wedge gets transformed to that dot. Okay, so if we aggressively move all these sliders to the right hand side, you'll see exactly what happens. So now pretty much everything is the same color tone and saturation and lightness. Now that's obviously way too aggressive. Sorry, I've forgotten your name again. I was going to say Andrew, but it's Anthony. So Anthony, if you were looking at correcting tan lines, you might need to be more aggressive. Excuse me, you might need to be more aggressive with the lightness slider down here. But I'm going to rack that back a bit because obviously we don't want to ruin any modeling that we have on the face. So now if we turn this layer off and back on, you can see the correction that's happening. However, of course, the disadvantage is that we're now correcting unwanted areas. So as I said, if we wanted to change our mask, we've got two choices. We can either delete the areas that we don't want affected, or we can clear the entire mask and brush it back in where it's needed, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to clear the mask. We've still got our underlying adjustments, and we can brush it back in where needed, which was the whole point of doing this exercise, because it points us to a really important adjustment or parameter of the brush. So if we right click, we've got this guy down here, flow. So size, you probably understand. Hardness is the softness of the brush. So the reason why we have these two circles is that the middle circle is at 100%, if you like, opacity, or sorry, I should say it's at the opacity set here, the strength of the brush. And as we get to the outer circle, it's faded to 0. So that gives you an idea of the feathering on the edge of the brush. Now the flow is a super important adjustment because it allows us to make nice, built up, organic, soft masks. So if you have a very low flow setting, that's equivalent to taking a pen or a pencil or a paintbrush is probably a better analogy, and having very little paint on it. And then brushing a wall, it's going to take you tons of brush strokes to build up that color. If we have flow to 100%, that's the equivalent of an extremely wet paintbrush, where one pass of the brush, you're going to lay down all that paint on the wall. So what it means is that if we keep this flow nice and low, I can gradually paint in this color adjustment I did here. Now, obviously with my mask showing, you can't really see what's going on. So let's clear that mask once more, hide my mask, and then we can start brushing. And what we're doing is gently brushing in that skin tone adjustment. Now, as I get to an area like the lips, like so, I would probably want to make my brush smaller so I could just be careful that I don't over paint on the side of her lips and then mess up the color. But for the rest of the areas, we can make pretty broad strokes and brush away that skin tone error. Now, as that's a fairly low flow, it's going to take a while to build up. So the benefit of that is if you have an area which you want to fix more, you can do more brushing. If you have an area that you want to fix less, then you can do less brushing. But then essentially we can brush around like so. Now, I'm not getting pedantic about cutting around this hairline really carefully because the edge of my brush is super soft. So we're not going to see much of a color shift or color change in that area. So I think part of the danger of masking is that you can get a little bit hypercritical over how accurate a mask needs to be. Sometimes it does, and we'll look at examples where obviously it makes sense, but quite often when we're dealing with skin tone, we want it to be a little bit more subtle. We could also, work on areas down here. And again, I'm totally not worried about over brushing onto her jacket as an example, because her jacket doesn't feature anywhere in this color range, so I'm not going to affect it. So by, the adjustments or the action in the brush itself, I don't have to be accurate because I can brush like crazy here and we're not going to make any difference. So keep that in mind as well, that the adjustments that you're brushing in aren't necessarily going to affect the entire range of the photo. So flow is super important. Now if we look at this, let's zoom out and we look at this as a grayscale mask. And this is a really essential way to view a mask if you're looking to better your masks, make better quality masks, see what they're doing without the distraction of the image. So if I turn this on, the image is going to be hidden and we're just going to see the mask expressed in grayscale. So where it's brightest or white, that means we've got the full strength of the adjustment over here that we're painting in. Where it's a little darker or black, there's no adjustment whatsoever. And where it's grayer, of course, we're having less of an adjustment. So it's a very, soft, subtle edge and so on. So that's the beauty of doing it this way. Now it's also good to see it as a red mask sometimes to see if you've missed any sections, like so. But again, I'm not worried about over brushing onto her shirt or whatever, because it's simply not going to have any effect. And I think sometimes that's what people forget. Your adjustment is also a mask in a way, because it's only going to affect generally certain parts of the picture. Now, if you're thinking that hasn't made any difference whatsoever, let's turn off the adjustment layer and you can see before and after like so. And don't forget, you can moderate with the opacity. So that adjustment flow is super important, not only for an adjustment like this on skin tone, but also for dodging and burning, those kinds of things. Any adjustment that you want to build up, gradually and subtly without it looking really obvious, because there's nothing worse than looking at an image and it being obvious that there's this, very badly constructed mask, which then becomes super obvious. And you see that on automated masks as well. Yes, quite often there's the ability to select sky, select background, or select subject or something like that. But sometimes, as I said at the start, even though that AI stuff is on the horizon, you still want to be in control and you still want to make those decisions to give you the best creative output, not necessarily just the fastest output. Okay, let's see if there's any questions. Nope, Marianne's answered them all nicely. So I'll just check if there's any common themes that come up, but Marianne's answered all of those, which is great. And you guys are quiet on YouTube at the moment, so that's also fine. Pete says P for professional. Exactly. So P mode, if you missed that, my argument being you don't necessarily stick your camera on automatic everything, you have some creative input as well. We know, which is why it's coming. Did you miss the first part? I'll tease you with something when we talk about this guy. So we've got this guy, and what I want to use this example for is to talk about a little known feature called refine mask. Where are you? Refine mask, which is a really powerful feature which can contribute to the quality of your masking in lots and lots of ways. So let's start. I'm going to make a new layer, and we're going to grab our brush, and we're going to do a really kind of bad manual mask around the edge of our kingfisher. Like so. I'm going to have full flow, and I'm just going to freehand it. So if I press M on the keyboard, you can see my mask. By the way, if you want to speed up manual masking, you can hold down Shift on your keyboard, and you can draw actually straight lines. So if I sort of do a blob here, hold down Shift and go there, then it's actually drawing a straight line between those edges. So that can sometimes be a quicker way to just draw a manual mask, or if you want to go around geometric objects and so on. And then we just go along the beak like so, make my brush super small and roughly draw something in. So that's a pretty, rudimentary, awful mask, I think you'd agree. So if we look at the grayscale mask, that's what I've drawn, like so. Now to save a bit of time, we can right click and we can say fill mask, and that will fill in the middle. Now if when you do that, a little tip, if it looks like a different opacity, make sure, if I just undo that for a second, make sure you don't have a gap, that you close the loop, that you actually do have, a complete loop closed, and then when you go ahead and fill mask, then it will fill the middle in quite nicely. So we've got our mask. Would I want to use that in its current state? Definitely not. So if I do something like change the brightness, it's not bad, but you see my little over brushing here isn't great. That becomes then very obvious. You might get away with something like noise reduction or sharpening or something like that, but any density exposure changes wouldn't be any good. But if we look at our grayscale mask again, and we're going to right click and we're going to bring up refine. So this is a function you can use on any mask that's been created by you with a brush, or with Capture One with a magic brush, or with a color mask that we'll look at later for tweaking any mask that you've created into something that looks a little bit nicer. So if we say refine mask and whack this up to full strength, you can see what happens. Now this is too much. So what it's doing is that it's looking at the difference between the masked area and the non-masked area, and then making that edge a much, much nicer edge, like so. And then obviously the greater the radius, the more it's going to bleed in from the masked area and the non-masked area. And I can see, once I've refined that, if I want to, tweak any other edges, like let's just take out that little mistake I made there, and then we actually have a much, much nicer mask. And then I would be totally fine with using that for density. Let's throw in a bit of clarity. We could add in a bit of sharpness and so on. So the refine tool takes you from, that pretty awful mask into something that was actually much, much more usable. And as I said, just because AI masking comes along doesn't mean that negates that tool. It's super useful for all kinds of functionality, and it's not often realized it's there, but it's just a simple right click and refine. You can refine again, so if you hadn't done enough, you could just open the tool back up and throw a bit more refining in there. It's totally fine, not a problem at all. All right. What does the airbrush option do? Oh, that's a good point, actually. So you see this. I never use it, if I'm completely honest. So that's So flow, if you like, that was a action based, if you like. So that's every brush of the mouse or pen, then you're laying down more adjustment or more masking, if you like. So if we just turn on, let's make a new layer and do a grayscale mask. So the image is going to go black. So if I grab my brush and the flow is nice and low, let's just make that a bit bigger so you can see what's going on. So as I brush back and forth, you can see the mask building up like so. If we turn the airbrush on, it's like a spray can. So that's time based. So if I click and hold, then it will start spraying and building up that mask. So if I just do a little tap, so it's like spraying paint, like so. I can't make my brain connect with my hand to do that in a subtle way. I much prefer being able to, you know, make subtle little brushes like so to build it up. So airbrush just makes that time based, exactly like a spray paint can, airbrush, or whatever. The greater the flow, the more squirty your can is, if you like. So if we up the flow and I brushed, you see it comes in almost instantly, like so. With a low flow, it means you turn the air pressure down on your airbrush and then it takes longer to build up, like so. But I just don't personally find it useful, but you know, it could have a use in your workflow. I just don't have it one for mine, but good question. It's not something I mention a lot. Now I said I'd tease you. So we looked at that mask, this guy, which, whoops, wrong shortcut. I was supposed to do that guy, grayscale mask. Didn't take me very long. If you guys weren't watching and I wasn't talking, it would be pretty quick. However, I did that earlier, just before we started, and that was a one-click mask based on AI tech in Capture One. So obviously you can look at this and think, yeah, actually that did a better job than David at that point. But I still would like to know how to refine and draw my mask manually, because certainly with AI, like if we take this example, and this is the same for any AI model, AI is great at picking out faces, but it's not necessarily so good at just picking out the skin bits without the hair. I mean, if we zoom in, it can do a great job of like selecting eyes or just the whites of the eyes, teeth, lips, and so on. But quite often it can't make that distinguish between hair and skin as such. So the ability to be able to, you know, make some of your own choices is really important. But on a subject like that, you know, when you look at the background, he's kind of blending into the background a bit. You know, to be able to build a one-click mask like that is super exciting. So I shall be glad when that's, as I said, just another tool to add to your toolbox as well. Cool. What's next? Bring that up. Okay. What auto mask, someone was asking. Again, it's not a subject I use a lot more. It's kind of superseded by the magic brush really. But what auto mask does is kind of detect, if we turn that on, you see you get a third ring on your brush, and it detects a difference between the inner and outer ring. And if it detects that, then it will draw a line. But I just find it quite slow to use. It's a pretty old tool, to be honest. So if we turn on our mask and then I brush along here, then it will find that edge like so, as you can see. But sometimes it fails. It just depends how accurate that is. So to be honest, I don't find that a useful tool. I would much rather use the magic brush or do it manually and refine it. All right, let's move on to luminosity mask. By the way, people in the chat room, if you want us to see your questions, put it in the Q&A tab. That will be a lot easier for us to find it. Pen pressure, Zach was asking. Let's just turn off auto mask. That links pen pressure to opacity. No, sorry, to size. So it links the pen pressure to size. I'm not deft enough with a, excuse me, Wacom pen to actually use that with any set of skill. I much prefer the shortcut, which is this. So if I hold down Control and Option on my keyboard, so these two, and then drag left and right, then it makes my brush bigger and smaller, like so. It doesn't look very smooth on your transmission because of the way, for some reason, the mouse is recorded on the live streaming software, but this is, you know, a smooth way to make your brush bigger and smaller, essentially. So Control and Option and drag left and right. If you're on a PC, you need to right click and use Control and Alt at the same time. All right, so let's talk about Luma Masking. Let's delete that layer. So Luma Masking does exactly what it says. It creates, well, it doesn't create a mask. It puts a constraint on an existing mask. So you have to build a mask first. Now that could be a mask you've drawn by hand, it could be a filled mask, it could be a gradient, it could be a radial, it could be created by the magic brush, and so on and so forth. So let's use this example. So I'm going to add a new field adjustment layer. And once again, this is where you do need to use your grayscale mask. It's much easier to see what's going on. So if I display grayscale mask, it's going to go to white because we've masked the entire image. And we want to use the Luma range to, let's say, just restrict it to the sky. So grayscale mask again, click on Luma range, and you get this little floating tool like so. And what you're telling Capture One is what part of the tonal range you want to have present in the image. So right now we've got the entire tonal range with the exception of the highlights, and then this slider down the bottom is the fall off. So you see how it has a nice graduation like so. If we were to slam that up to the top, it would be a much more binary, nasty fall off. But we want all the bright stuff. So we are going to slide this to the right until we eventually cut out all the shadows. Let's move this down a bit, and we get to this point, and that's too much because I'm looking at the sky and it's starting to vignette. So I want to come back to about there. So now what we've done is just restrict our mask to these tonal values like so. So what it's done, it's selected the sky, and it's also selected a bit of the river, which is not what I want, but we can fix that in a second. Excuse me. Now at any point, we can go back into the Luma range tool and tweak it. So it's not set in stone once you've adjusted it, you can always play around with it. Now what would have made more sense, because I didn't want the river as part of my adjustment. So what we're going to do is clear that mask, like so. Actually, we're going to delete that mask and we start again. We're going to grab a brush, make sure my flow is at 100, and then, oh, let's turn grayscale mask off, sorry. Make sure my mask is at 100, and then we're just going to draw. Helps if you press the right shortcut. And we're just going to draw a super rough mask like so. Just make sure I've got that bit. And then we're going to right click and say fill mask. We'll look at our grayscale mask again, and then we go into our Luma range and just do the same operation. So now I can restrict that quite nicely to just my sky, like so. Now by default, if we look at the edge, see it's a little bit on the crunchy binary side. It's not much, you know, finesse to it. It's very accurate, but when we start throwing in adjustments, it might not look supernatural. And this is the whole point of talking about this feature with a view with what's available today and what's going to be available in the future, because everything you see now is still going to be valid in your editing in the future. Perfectly timed question. What about radius and sensitivity? What are they? Well, this relates to the edge essentially, and it's kind of similar to a refine tool. So if we go back into Luma range, radius at 0 means this slider does nothing. So you can pull this slider around to extremities and it will make no difference, because we need to describe a radius, or like a distance that we want to go from the masked area to the non-masked area. So if I bump up the radius and then bump up sensitivity, what it will do is just refine and clean up that edge a little bit if you go in this direction. If I go in this direction, it will feather it. So that will soften the edge, which sometimes can be nice for skin tones. If you do manage to have, you know, a skin tone which you can select or modify a mask with the Luma range tool, sometimes it's quite nice to feather it. If I have a greater radius, then my feathering is going to be spread out more. So that's a little bit too much. If I wanted to refine, I would then go in that direction, and that will just clean up the edge for us a little bit. So if we say apply, then we end up with, you know, pretty nice mask of the sky, like so. Simple. So then what we can do, of course, we can go ahead and we can tweak our, you know, brightness, saturation or whatever, make it darker, brighter, and so on and so forth. However, Neil, you've read my mind. Could the Luma range be applied to a linear gradient tool? Yes, it can, and a radial one. And to be honest, will be much better in a situation like this, because we do actually want a bit of natural fall off as we reach a skyline. And let's do that. So let's turn off that layer. We'll keep that layer as a bit of a comparison. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make a new layer. So let's just call that Luma only. And then this one, we're going to grab our gradient mask and we're going to throw on our gradient like so. And most gradients are generally fairly useless in their virgin state because it's very rare you have a landscape or a situation, I don't know, in an interior or exterior or something like that, where you have a perfect, you know, horizontal line that you want to make some kind of change to. So there's always going to be something in the background. If I hold my Option key down or Alt key on the PC, then we can change how the fall off runs. So I want a slightly more aggressive fall off, so I'm going to do that. If we look at it on our Luma range, we end up with this. Good news is, Neil, we can then put excuse me, we can then put a Luma range on top of that. So if we stab Luma range like so, we can do exactly the same thing before, and then we end up with a mask that is, let's just bump up our sensitivity a little bit. We end up with a mask that is actually a lot nicer than before, because we now have a little bit of subtle fall off. And the good news is we can tweak our gradient mask, and you see it's always gonna cut itself around that hillside, which is super nice, like so. So we can do something like that, and we've got a gradient, but it also doesn't mess with our hills, because if we wanted to do a density change, we actually wouldn't want it to happen along here. We'd only want it to happen in the sky. So this works much, much nicer. So now if I want to do my tweak, so let's bump up saturation like so. We could do a color pick maybe. Let's pick in the blues. Thank you. And we could up the saturation as well. Anyway, you get the idea. But now we end up with something that's a lot more natural. No AI mask in any application will do that for you. It'll go, boom, I've selected the sky. I'm so super clever. Thank you very much. But often you don't actually want to do that. You want to create something that's just a little bit nicer and a little bit more organic. And you can do that very nicely with Capture One, obviously. If we compare that to, so that's our Luma and Grad, and then that's our, sorry, let's go on to there, and that's our Luma only, like so. So you can see the difference. Let's turn those on, like so. Subtle, but it's there. Same goes for if we pick something, and this would be a situation where a Grad mask is completely useless without some kind of adjustment, because our mountain range here, if I just want to play with the sky or whatever, yes, I can excuse frog in my throat today. Yes, we can select the sky, but again, like we saw earlier, it's actually nicer to have that subtle gradation in it. So once again, if we look at our grayscale mask, if you've forgotten the shortcut, Option M, stick our Luma range on it, and we could end up with something like that, like so. And then now when we go ahead and do our adjustments, we're actually going to have a nicer result at the end of the day, like so. Because the sun is over here somewhere, or at least over to the east. So we're getting a little bit of a glow over the top of the mountain, and we want to keep that, and we want to make sure it's, you know, nice and subtly handled as well. Now you could argue, well, that's fine, but you've got some bits here which I might not want to adjust, but I'm happy with how the gradient is looking. But no matter what I do with the Luma range, I could try and, you know, cut them out, but now I'm getting this vignetting here, which isn't good. So what we can do is, like so, is we have an important tool here called rasterize. So right now we've got two floating dimensions, if you like. We can change our gradient mask quite nicely. We can change our Luma range by hitting that button. So we've got two dynamic things that we can play with. When we get to the point that, you know, we're happy, and if we want to make some other subtle changes to the mask, like get rid of that little piece of the mask, I can right click and say rasterize. And that will simply stamp the mask as it is right now, but it's going to remove the Luma range contingent, and it's going to remove my ability to tweak the gradient mask, but it's going to give me a mask as is, like so. So if I want to erase that little error over there, I can do so. If I wanted to erase these bits, I could do so as well, like so. So I could go on a little cleanup mission if I really wanted to make that mask, you know, as accurate as possible. Janelle had a question. Is it better to make a selection before Luma range or go straight to Luma range? You have to make a selection before. And this is something I remember years ago when Luma range first came out. I didn't quite get my head around it. But if we go to a shot with nothing on it, let's reset that. This one. I can't press Luma range. So it's grayed out. So you have to give it a mask for it to put its constraint on. Whether that's hand-drawn, gradient, radius, magic brush created, AI created in the future, or whatever, you have to give it something to work with. So to give you another example, let's go to our buildings. So we've got cityscape pretty much adjusted as I want it, except for Salesforce building at the back. There is the windows are a little bit too much on the bright side. And I don't want to play with my whites and highlights anymore, because if I do so, it's going to make my traffic trails muddy and nasty. So I don't want to do that. So what I want to do is just specifically control the highlights on the building here. Now there's a couple of ways I could do it. I could do a pretty much rough mask and just pull the highlights down. But let's say, I don't know, the moon was peeping out behind here or something like that, or there was something in the sky that I didn't want it to affect, and I just want to really target those highlights, especially if I wanted to change the color, like if I wanted to warm them up a bit, cool them down or whatever. I definitely would not want any of this sky selected whatsoever. So I want to be a little bit more particular about my mask. So if we make a new layer, let's call this building, my goodness, building rear, grab a brush, let's make this a little bit smaller, and just paint kind of loosely over the building, like so. Maybe I want some down here as well, and then this one, like so. So I didn't spend any time doing that. Let's look at my grayscale mask. Pretty rough. Let's turn on Luma range, and I only want the bright stuff. So we're going to do that, like so. We could also have a bit more of a fall off, so it's a bit more subtle. And now I've just got my bright lights at the back. So what I can do now, I could pull those highlights and whites down, and then it's only controlled in that area. And if I wanted to tweak the color, if I wanted to make them, you know, warmer, I'm exaggerating, of course, then I could do so without, you know, affecting the sky or anything like that. Now, good thing to notice that you've now built yourself a highlight brush. So let's say I was tweaking the colors, and I will just warm those up slightly. I was tweaking the colors and I want to do the same thing elsewhere. So if I turn on my grayscale mask once more, wherever I brush now with this, it's only going to be a highlight brush. So actually I've got no idea where I'm brushing, but see, look, if I start brushing here, we're just brushing in that correction, but the highlights only. So it's only affecting, so wherever I, you know, brush like so, it's only going to affect my highlights. So you've built yourself a highlight brush which you could then use to brush in the same correction that we've done on that layer. Now if I was just doing highlights correction, I wouldn't have bothered with that Luma masking additional bit, but if I wanted to tweak the color balance, add sharpening, noise reduction or something like that, then obviously I would not want it to affect anywhere except for those highlights. So it's a really handy tool for, you know, all kinds of applications. Let's see. Just checking your questions. Remember, pop in the Q&A tab so we can find them, because they will get lost in the chat otherwise. So we answered airbrushing. Link, that's a good question for brushes. Link, brush with layer, eraser with brush. So it means if you have lots of layers, which might have different kinds of adjustments and different brush sizes, it means your brush size is remembered for that layer. So if I make the brush super tiny on that layer and then super big on this layer, you'll see as I go to layer 2, tiny brush, layer 1, big brush. So if you're going back through your layers and then tweaking the adjustments, then it will remember the settings you had for the brush. And link eraser with brush means that if I switch to eraser, it uses the same parameters. So it's very nice to be able to, you know, dodging and burning, for example, if I'm burning and I've done too much, I can then quickly go from brush, B on my keyboard, to eraser, E on the keyboard, and it will behave in exactly the same way. So those two checkboxes are really, really super handy. Just checking questions there. Could we explain color mask? Yes, we definitely will, Richard. That's coming up, so don't worry about that. That's probably going to be the next thing, I would say, once we've checked on a couple of questions. Doug says, why rasterize a mask rather than stack multiple mask layers? Well, you can't merge down if you're thinking of Photoshop. Remember, we're working on a raw file, it's non-destructive, so if you've got, you know, 4 or 5 layers, you then can't say merge those layers. And to be honest, you only need to rasterize a mask if you need to edit it for some reason. So it turns that mask editable, if that's a word. So in that situation where we had that little, you know, hole in the mask that I wanted to erase, I could only do that by rasterizing it and then being able to edit it, because what I'd done, I'd had a gradient mask, which is, you know, infinitely variable, and a Luma mask on top of that. So to be able to then edit the actual mask, I had to rasterize it first. Okay, but you don't need to do it if you've got no need to do so. All right. How to change a shade color? Not fully sure what you mean, but I think perhaps we might see it on this picture. So the last thing we're going to mention before I let you go is using the color editor to create a mask. So yes, the color editor had some adjustments of itself. So if I grab the color picker and click on her woven shirt, then straight away what you're going to see is the dot. So that's the exact color tone I picked and the range of colors that we're going to select. And I think it was Anthony who asked, what does this mean? So if we turn that on, everything will go to monochrome that is not part of the selection. So if we turn this off, if you look at her skin tone and her hair to some extent, that turns black and white because they're not in my selection. If I did that, then you see her skin tone pops back and then goes out, or probably this way as well to some extent. So that's our color range. Let me just reset that and re-pick so we get capture one suggestion. And in this direction, this is our saturation range. Now this image is super handy because if we turn on view selected color range, the background is actually almost an identical color tone to this, but just less saturated. So if I reset that and just pick the background, it's not far off, is it? I think our our shirt pick was around here somewhere, and then the background is around here. So if we pick our shirt once more, turn on view selected color range, I can actually cut out the background by saying, don't give me any of the lower saturated stuff. Let's focus on, you know, her shirt essentially. If I pull this back in, we actually start to pick the background a little bit. So that's what view selected color range does, and it's very handy. This button just says span the entire range, so it's a shortcut to do that, which we don't want to do in this case. We want to cut that out. And this one inverts it, so it will do the opposite. So that will do everything except our picked color, which is handy if you've got, you know, a color tone in image, blue sky, let's take something obvious, and you're happy with that, but you want to desaturate everything else or saturate everything else. So it's a way of protecting a color in a selection. So we've got our color range selection, and then of course with our color editor we can do stuff like we can change the lightness, we can change the saturation, we can change the hue to a subtle amount, and so on. Smoothness is just how much roll off we have between the in-range colors and the out-of-range colors. So it gives you a nice roll off in that transition. But we can only do hue, saturation, lightness. We couldn't, you know, change the density any more than the lightness slider. If we wanted to add, you know, noise reduction, sharpening or something, or drastically change the color, then we wouldn't be able to do so. So we can turn that into a mask. So hidden in the three dots is create mask layer from selection. So if I do that, very quickly we get a mask. And you can see it here. If I do Option M, we've got a mask like so. Now, what I will say about creating a mask from color is that they can be a little bit on the binary side. There's not much, you know, organic business going on with the edges. So you will need to either feather it or refine it, or a bit of both. So let's see what refine does. So if I bump this up to 300, that's a little bit too much, so we can pull that down just to soften the edges, and if we wanted to soften it further we could also feather it. Obviously if I feather it a lot it will be super soft. If we just give it a little bit of softness around there, then we've given ourselves a nicer mask that we can deal with. And now we can do anything with that. So if I wanted to drastically change the density, you know, desaturated, if this one isn't in focus, but if this was a feature of a garment which I wanted to sharpen up, drop in some additional noise reduction or whatever, then I could do so because we have that mask, and that gives us access to the rest of the tools in Capture One. Out of interest, if we do the background, what happens? So I've selected the background. If we turn on view selected color range, we can probably pull that down a touch. It's going to select a bit in her shirt probably, but let's see how we deal with that. Let's turn off view selected color range, and we can say create mask layer from selection. So let's just call that shirt so I know what's what. And if we look at our background, let's see what happened. Not bad actually. If we grab our erase brush, let's make that like so, then we can, helps if the flow is up to 100, not 4, then we could clean up the mask if we wanted, and then we got a background like so. So yeah, it can be really super handy. Very, very handy to be able to select using color, but as I said, they can be a little bit binary, so it helps to refine, it helps to feather if you want to make it a bit more subtle. Now you can do this on a batch, so let's just reset those and keep that. So if I select all of these 3 pictures, so we've got our color range selection on number 1. So if I say display grayscale mask first of all, and notice obviously she's changed position, so her blouse has changed position or her shirt has changed position. So if I say create mask layer from selection, it's going to run it on all 3. So there's our first, there's our second and third, like so. So you can do it in a batch. Now you can't do the refining, unfortunately, in a batch or whatever, but at least you can get that, you know, bulk side of it out the way as well. So really, really useful tool. Shaya is saying, the masking in Capture One is so powerful, glad you think so. Far and away what sets it apart from the competitors. Any word when masking layers will be available on the iPad version? I can't give you a date. I know it's been discussed and talked about and we want to do it, but I just don't know exactly when it will arrive. But it certainly would be a nice addition, definitely. All right, let's clean up the last couple of questions. Let's turn off our grayscale mask because that looks super weird staring at that. And see if there's any final questions to answer. So we did our airbrush one. We talked about rasterizing, and Frederick asked about tan line. So yes, that was using the lightness slider in uniformity. Try it on that. Let's see, if this woman had a coloured lamp in the background drooling on her arm, do lamps drool? I guess drifting, the colour spill drifting on her arm. What would be the right masking to eliminate this diffuse colour on her arm? I would use the skin tone tool, to be honest. Now, just because it's called skin tone doesn't mean it's only for skin tones. It's essentially a tool that allows you to unify colours. So, you know, on this background, if I clicked on the blue background and I said, and we incorporated our shirt and we said hue, saturation, lightness, we'd actually make her shirt the same color as the background here, like so. So it's just a tool for making uniform. So if there was light spilling on her shoulder, then I would pick the good skin tone and then make sure I included the drooly light color in the selection and then use the hue, saturation, lightness sliders. And obviously with masking you could just target it where you needed it to be. Much like the original picture, I mean, we've got an issue because we've got warm light coming from the right hand side of her face and then shadow on the left, which is why we got that mismatch in color. So it's a similar situation. You're picking a target skin tone, making sure the bad color is part of the selection, and then using those sliders to uniform it up with the use of masking as well. So I hope that answers your question. Can you minimize or maximize the mask to adjust the mask outline size? No, I think what you're asking for is, I can't remember the term in Photoshop, is it shrink or modify, where you can add a pixel value? No, it's not possible, but it could be a nice addition actually, to be honest. But no, it's not possible at the moment. Otherwise, I think we have pretty much covered it. So what Marianne's answered about a billion questions, so thank you, Marianne, for that. I'm going to put up this slide just to remind you. So that QR code will take you to this page, which is support.captureone.com, to the Learning Hub and our live streams. So if you would like to join me on September 28th, we're going to be talking about collaboration. So that's using Capture One Live, using EIP files, sending images to other people who you might wish for them to work on, and so forth. So a few other collaboration things we can talk about. Now, I teased you a bit with AI masking by showing you that guy, if you remember. So the one-click AI solution as opposed to the manual one that we did. Still worth knowing how to do both. I won't budge on that. So if you want to be the first to know about offers, discounts and so on, and the latest updates about forthcoming releases, then that QR code, if you scan that with your phone, will take you to the page which you can see behind the QR code, and you'll be the first to know and get some nice offers as well. If you're in the live streaming room, you can click that white box above the chat. That will take you to the same page, or I can post a link as well. I'll do the same on YouTube in a minute if I can remember the code, which I'm doing now. Capture one.co, so I appreciate not everyone has the ability to scan a QR code compared to everyone else. Sorry, not everyone has the ability to scan. What am I saying? Not everyone has the ability to scan a QR code with their smartphone. So you can use that link as well, and that will take you to the same page. So I hope that was useful today. You know, very rarely a hand-drawn manual mask will cut it. There's loads of other ways that you can create masks, make them better with the refine tool, feather tool, Luma masking. You know, when we looked at this example with our building, that's a really nice example where we can just use the Luma mask to create ourselves a highlight brush essentially, but you can make a mid-tone brush, a shadow brush, and so on and so forth. So very useful stuff. All right, thanks for joining me today, everybody. Enjoy your weekend when it arrives, and enjoy the rest of your week. So take care and see you all soon. Bye now.